All right, so this is contemporary lit theory, and we're going to go through just the syllabus today, and I'm going to talk to you about what I put on the syllabus and why I put it on the syllabus, and in what order I put it on the syllabus, and talk a little bit about how this course related to the last course, which not all of you will have done. All of you did do, in fact. So that's helpful. Sometimes I've found people come into this class just out of the blue. But it's helpful to have had last semester under your belts when you come to this one, because come the 20th century, the lit theories go in a myriad of directions, and there doesn't seem a lot holding them together. There's a sort of a commitment to disintegration from, and then breaking into various camps and so forth, and literary theories, rather than a coherent literary theory that would encompass the humanities as a whole. So it's useful what we had last semester, in the sense that I thought, even though we could trace what various writers had said over the course of millennia, there was a commonality there in what they were speaking of that I think without which it's very difficult to make true statements, or at least statements acceptable to me. Because post-1960s, and most of the lit theories that we're going to talk about are post-1960s, there are various identity group approaches to the study of literature. And my chief objection to them is the same. And it doesn't matter which one it is, whether it's queer theory or feminist theory or post-colonial theory or Latino, whatever the group. It's that they don't have a sense of a common humanity. They speak as literature on behalf of a group, and then justify that advocacy work in the academy because the groups have been marginalized, ignored, whatever, some sort of an explanation. And therefore, they're deserving of further study and inclusion in the canon of literature. And that begs the question of the canon of literature. What is it? Why did it come about? What's the purpose of a canon? We'll look at that as well. And you'll find it interesting to know that even traditional writers like C.S. Lewis, when I say traditional, in the sense that we would associate him with upholding a tradition, didn't like the idea of a canon of literature. He didn't like the idea. It was a relatively, and it didn't exist when he was working, per se, or at least it was not a dominant idea that it should be so. Because a canon, if you know any Latin, a canon is a rule or a measure. It's the measure for other literary works, and he thought that it was misapplied to secular literature or non-biblical literature. There might be a canon of scripture. These are the rules and norms for the faith. Are there such rules and norms that apply to literature? And if there are, which I happen to think there are, by the way, and I think he does as well, does it have the further implication that things that are outside the canon are therefore less relevant or perhaps even heretical? And I think he would be wary of that idea. And so he is unhappy with F.R. Leavis for suggesting that there is a sort of a canon. And in the 1960s, it becomes a very potent political thing in the United States, probably because of the civil rights movement and so forth, the canon wars, which become quite heavy and volatile in the 1980s when I was an undergrad. And nowadays, there is no canon left. So there's no sort of core literary texts that one would say, if you want to be an educated person, you should have read these works, at least, and know these authors. And if maybe not as an undergraduate, by the time you die, you really want to read these people. And so there's a counter movement, Mortimer Adler and so forth, the great books. which I think is a good idea. On the other hand, I understand Lewis's objections to the idea of a canon and the unintended consequence of that is the belief that things that are non-canonical are irrelevant or even heretical. And there are heretical texts, don't get me wrong, and problematic texts, but he just doesn't like the idea, and I have some sympathy for that. But the course, as I set it up, will draw upon what you did last semester, I hope, at least insofar as it will allow us to do what I'm going to do most of the semester, which is to critique the critics. Even more so than I did in the previous rendition. So the literary theory all the way up to the 19th century, I think, is fairly strongly rooted in the past. Even the Romantics are rooted in the concepts and the categories that they have received from the classical age and the Christian era. And but I do think there's a radical shift come the Romantic period. It is the cusp of a transformation. And I've called it the transformation from the humanities to the human sciences. But you heard me talk about that, and I've cited my book on that subject as well, which to some degree speaks to that. But this course then will try and pick up the narrative in the 20th century and then talk about some sort of foundational texts for the later writers, and we'll try and, every time I teach this, it's a different course. Like most of my courses are pretty similar, or once I've taught it, it's basically there. This one is different because the field keeps changing. When I first started teaching it, just to give you an example, I didn't teach queer theory. I thought it was a marginal area in the sense of its interests and its influence in the academy. And now I could no longer say that. There's no way I could say, I mean, this is my 16th year here, so I can't do that. It is so. So I can't ignore it if I'm doing what I wish to do here, which is to help you engage with the world of literary criticism as you experience it. So now we do indulge in that. Also, eco-criticism. It didn't exist back when I started here. Now my doctoral supervisor, Timothy Clark, writes as an eco-critic at the University of Durham. And there's a substantive body of material in that area now, and it's being taught in the public universities at grad school level and so forth. Some former Tyndale graduates have gone on and told me that my sense of these things was right, that it is very strong now. Queer theory, feminist theory, whatever that means, we'll come to that because it's transformed over the years. And most of all, the emphasis has shifted more towards transhumanism and posthumanism. And eco-theory is a species of posthumanism, by the way. Or at least that's what I'm going to argue. Because what eco-criticism effectively presents is that there's nothing special about human nature. And there's no privileged location for a human being in the whole scheme of things. So it's moving the David Suzuki realm. You know, we're just biological beings on the planet like others. And in some posthumanism, it will move even further beyond that and not even worry about sentient life or even biological life, but it will embrace the idea of a cyborg humanity, where we ought to consider the computers and so forth as having rights similar to those of human beings. This is expressing itself in ethics and in legal debates of our day. You know, what constitutes a person? They ought to have personal rights. Well, personhood is a category of the church. It's discussions of the persons of the Trinity. And because we bear the Imago Dei, there's a discussion amongst the church fathers of what it means to be a human being. What it means to be a human being means to be a person, because God is tri-personal. now that's moved down to giving personal rights to organizations. So like entities, they are considered to be persons. Like a big Tyndale would have, in jurisprudence, would have something of agency and personhood. And so Tyndale would be taken almost as a metaphor, as a person having done certain things and could be held responsible as an organization. But it also descends down to your pets and their rights, or chimps, or whatever, or other animals. Toronto Zoo used to have elephants. It doesn't have them anymore, largely because of a PR campaign. But I think the main sense is they had rights. The animals had rights. Rights are things that you attribute to people, right? But it was animal rights, so the animal rights movement. Now I think you can support, by the way, animals and speak against cruelty to them without attributing rights to them. You can say that we have a duty of care towards them. That's a different thing, right? These are God's creatures. We have a responsibility right back in Genesis to look after the earth and everything in it, including the animals. That's a duty, but that doesn't say, that's not the same language as attributing rights to the creatures, right? But the language is shifted in that way. Well, that gives personal agency to these same beings. That's problematic. So all of these are symptoms of, I think, a zeroing in on human nature and an attack on human nature. And along with it, there is, and we're going to come to this book in a bit, a war on the word, which is characteristic of literary theory. Now, for us, as we discussed last semester, these two things are linked because, of course, Jesus is the Word of God. Jesus is the person. He is the incarnate Word, the Word made flesh. And so there is some sort of a connection between words and the Word and our humanity and our use of words. So this nexus of interests are all being picked apart in literary theory in the 20th century. And it's now spilled over into the other humanities. So I noticed, to my dismay, but not my surprise, I didn't even plug in this stupid thing, so let me plug this in. That was me. And hopefully the sound quality will jump up at this point. There is a spillage of the problems of lit theory that have now seeped into not only theology for quite a while, and biblical studies, but even the natural sciences. Lots of agendas and identity groups and this sort of thing. And science is being questioned, and rightly so, as not having the objectivity that it claimed it had. So everything's become politicized. These are all effects of the attack on human nature. And part of human nature is the capacity for reason. That goes with speaking, right? Because words entail a rationality, logos, logic, etc. So contemporary literary theories will even go so far as to dispute that basic categories of logic apply. So the law of non-contradiction, which is one of the three laws of logic that Aristotle talks about, the law of identity, the law of, I'm going to miss one. The third one's the law of non-contradiction. Well, gender identity theory breaks the law of non-contradiction. So if it's true that I can claim to be a female while being physically, biologically a male, in what possible sense do words make sense anymore? How can we reason about these things? We can't. So this, as a category, is inherently destructive to the life of the mind in the academy. And with it, not just in the academy, it spills over into society as a real social contagion. Defies common sense. I cannot, with my own set of eyes, police things like male and female. So in a woman's washroom, I can't say, that's a male, you're not allowed in here.
the effect of that is to require the state to police it. If I can't police it myself and people won't listen to reasoning, then it has to come with a heavy hand of bureaucracy. And so that ties in with a further problem in the 20th century, which is the rise of bureaucracy and the rule of the desk, which is the rule of no one, by the way. And lots of horror literature written about it in the 20th century. Kafka's being probably the foremost. Where you're in a process, you're guilty of something. You don't even know what you're guilty of, perhaps, but the process has begun, and how do you get out of the process? Well, you have to write to this office. You write to the office, and they close the office door at that time because they're on a lunch break or whatever, and they don't come back and whatever, and you end up getting shunted along anyway. There's a work by Kafka called The Trial, at the end of which he gets shot. I've given it all away. But he's talking about the bureaucracy that starts to grow and become more and more inhuman in its working as well. So this is all connected with the same sort of thing, and I do think it's connected with an assault on our humanity made in Imago Dei. So that's the thrust of the course, the general, and I'll go through the specific weeks here now and talk about what we're going to look at. So these are the texts here. You will have seen these already. There are 1, 2, 3, 4. This one, I'm told, is not available. The library can't get it, but you can on Amazon. Have you read it? Did you get it? If you haven't, you need to get it. It's going to be part of the assessment of the course. Because I think most of the stuff I'm putting on here I don't agree with, and some of it I don't agree with it at all. Like, not at all. 100% don't agree with it. This one is more, we're on the same page, and I think what he says is quite helpful and often actually quite insightful. So he'll cite in the first chapter here on Derrida or deity, he talks about Augustine's view of language in a way that I would have liked to have done myself if I were writing a book on this. I think he does, and we talked about Augustine and his importance last semester. I think it will resonate with you, and you'll find it a helpful navigation, because we're going to begin with this book by Terry Eagleton, Literary Theory. This is the second edition. I think it's still in the second edition. Terry Eagleton's still alive. He's a British literary theorist, prolific writer. You can look him up on YouTube. You'll get to see him lecturing, speaking, and so forth. He's a Marxist. Or at least he was for a very long time, and when he writes this, he is a Marxist. But this textbook is a standard textbook used in the UK. And I believe it's still used, and I think it's often used here in Canada as well. It's useful, not because I necessarily agree with it, because I don't, but because it acquaints you with what is being said by a prominent literary theorist about literature and the arguments being used about literature. And I'll go through it, and then I will take issue with what he said, and we'll have a discussion about the assumptions that he's making, or assertions that he's making, that often are misrepresenting the facts on the ground. That's my contention. But we'll begin this first week with his introduction, What is Literature? Because in that he's going to claim something which sounds rather shocking. It may be one day he says that we will no longer regard Shakespeare as literature. Now, when did he first write this? 1983. First published 1983. Well, when he wrote that was ridiculous. So in the UK on Radio 4, there's a weekly program called Desert Island Discs. And every person who's on there is allowed, so they get various celebrities, politicians, whatever, on there, and they get them to tell their favorite 6 discs, CDs, musical tracks, whatever, and then tell a little story about them. And then at the end of the whole installment, they ask the person, okay, so what do you want with you? What book do you want with you at the end of it all? And they can't say the Bible or Shakespeare, because they just give them that. like, because too many people are, when they started the program, everyone would have said one of those two probably. So you've got the Bible and you've got Shakespeare. What else do you want on the island? Well, that's because it was unthinkable that you wouldn't consider Shakespeare to be a great author whom you would want to read. If you were going to read anything, you want that. It's part of being English. Remember, this is an English program. I've heard people on that show, atheists, say, well, on my island, I want the Bible off it. But I never heard anyone say, I want Shakespeare off it. Never. And I'm not sure if that's the case now. I don't listen to it anymore. But at the University of California, they banished Shakespeare from the curriculum, from its state universities. It's coming here as well. Shakespeare's a dead white male, a patriarchal figure, all that sort of stuff, imposing a sort of view on reality that we no longer agree with. When I say we, the we of the left, whatever the left means now. So Shakespeare, which was taught in high schools here without any, to my mind, any agenda, is now, I think, still there, but it's no longer required as it once was. And when I did it in high school, it was grade 9 through grade 13. When I started teaching this course, it was required reading in high school. And now I find that it's no longer so. So his prediction that one day, like just as a hypothetical, we may no longer regard Shakespeare as literature. So what is literature? That's what Eagleton is going to present as a absurd hypothesis. And now it is so. That's how crazy the world's become, in a sense, or how much it's changed. I say crazy because I think it is crazy. Others regard it as a nice, good change, obviously. Otherwise it wouldn't happen. But we'll look at his what is literature and what he says about it, and some of it's interesting and correct, I think, and some of it is pretty out there. And then we'll look at Harold Bloom, and I'll post a link for you, a handout on the Western canon. Harold Bloom was the American literary critic. He's a Jewish writer, but not Orthodox by any means. Prolific, wrote works on. He's a Romantic scholar from the outset. He's a Romantic scholar who eventually gravitates towards all sorts of literary works. So he wrote works on Shakespeare, and one called the Western Canon. So this came out, and I can't remember the year, but probably in the 90s, and it was a firestorm when it came out. And you've just heard what I said about the Western Canon, my concerns about it. Eagleton's writing in the context of the canon wars in the United States, where effectively they are tearing apart the common inheritance of material that people would have read and taken delight in and maybe taken issue with, but still thought these are great works of literature, and he puts them out there. So we'll look at what he says about that, and I think it's just setting the stage. Then we will move and to Eliot, then, T.S. Eliot, Tradition and the Individual Talent, in which he talks about tradition. So these are more conservative thinkers writing on the subject, although I would never have called Bloom a conservative up until that time. And even then, I wouldn't call him a conservative. He's an old-fashioned liberal without any allegiance to, obviously, the Christian faith, but even certain... So he writes his book on Shakespeare, Shakespeare and the Invention of the Human. That's the title. He doesn't mean it too literally. Shakespeare didn't, he wasn't like Prometheus and breathed air into the clay figures and gave them life, but he, in the sense that our modern sense of ourselves is an inheritance of the way Shakespeare looked at the world. I actually think it's flat wrong, but it's interesting anyway. And Eagleton, when he was writing this, as I say, he was the foremost lit theorist and on the avant-garde in some ways, but he was attacked by the various schools of resentment and so forth, and booed and hissed and so forth. In the end, by the way, and this is just an interesting side note, Bloom left his whole personal library. He taught at Yale for 40 years. He left it to a small Catholic liberal arts college because he said only these little Christian liberal art colleges are doing and revere the great books in the way that I do. Interesting. That was 20 years ago. That much more so now. So we'll look at that, and then we'll look at Eagleton's account of the rise of English, which I think is interesting and informative. As a subject of study, we all know Lewis and Tolkien. When Lewis is given his position at Oxford teaching English, English had not existed when he studied. It's a new discipline. He studied classics. He did so-called greats, Greek and Latin literature and philosophy. He didn't study English. He taught it. It was regarded as, well, of course you're going to read English, but it's not a serious subject of study, right? It's of academic study per se, and they were charged with making it one. Then how do we go about that? But that's now 1920s, 26 or thereabouts. So it's not 100 years ago. It begins in the women's colleges as a, polite subject, but not very serious. So he talks a little bit about that, and that's interesting. Then we'll go to Gerald Bruns, and I'll have to include that in his introduction there. Again, taking a big picture, but now talking about the issue of hermeneutics and interpretation, and coming at it from the perspective of probably Heidegger and the German continental tradition, which is the tradition I'm most familiar with. I think it's a useful summary. We'll read that, and then the radical turn in hermeneutics which follows. And the radical turn will be in Heidegger's ontological turn. Now, that's a very philosophical way of looking at it. So at this point, it becomes more philosophical and less literary. We'll come back to the literary. And Eagleton's commentary on this will talk about the whole picture as well from his vantage point, what's happened. Then we'll finally do something that I used to put at the very front of the course, which is Saussure's book on structuralism and his view of what language is and how it works. Because it's a basic core text, and I used to have it right at the beginning because later writers refer back to it. Certainly in the 1960s, they are engaging with Saussure and his general course in linguistics. So he's a linguist, not a literary theorist, but his views on what language is inform what literary scholars do with this. And then I'll move, and I've included this for the first time this year, Northrop Frye's Archetypes of Literature. I'll get that, and I think that many of these come out of this book, so the Norton Anthology. I believe this is in the Norton Anthology, 1304. Let's confirm this, but I'm pretty sure that that's right. I've got so many different books of literary theory. Yeah, that's right. And Frye is effectively presenting something along the same lines that Jordan Peterson is doing now. Suggesting that there's almost a pattern and a psychological pattern that explains literature. It's rooted in the psyche, and it's rooted. We can see that as it works out in the literary corpus, and that includes the Bible and all other types of literature. And that's becoming popular again, I think, and I predict it will become more popular because of Peterson and because of other writers. There's this satisfaction with what Peterson calls the postmodernists, rather sloppily, perhaps, because it's not his field, and and a desire for something. Well, there is something real there. Like, come on. There's a psychological truth that when we read a story, we think no, this is bang on the money. What is that? And Fry's Canadian scholar, great one at that, who wrote on this very effectively. So we'll foray into that, and then we'll come back and we will discuss this book, At War with the Word. But by that point, and I believe the first essay, it says first essay, but it's not a first essay. Or it says essay, okay, but it's not. It's going to be a book review of this. So not only do I want you to read it, I want you to really read it and tell me what it's saying and give me a synopsis of the argument. I mean, it's got how many chapters here? 5, I think. And give me a synopsis of it, and I think you'll find it helpful for your own thinking through the issues. That's why. And then we'll do a proper essay at the end, a lengthier one. But I'd like a book review of that book, because he is talking about, and the subtitle of this is Literary Theory and Liberal Education. So it's not just talking about the literary theory, but the whole effect it has on education, which brings us back to the topic in my other course on C.S. Lewis. We're starting off with The Abolition of Man. He's writing about the same thing, right? All these things start to connect, at least in my mind. And in Jung's mind, he was the editor of ISI, by the way, which is a fantastic American venture south of the border. So we'll come back, and then I will talk about what you've handed in at the beginning of the class. And if you haven't handed it, I'll record my thing, but I won't put it up online until it all comes back. I guess I couldn't do that. And then we'll move on to the breakup or the implications of the structuralism in semiotics and in cultural Marxism and post-structuralism and so forth. I never used to have cultural Marxism on here either, because again, I thought it was part of the left wing of the British Academy and hadn't made such profound inroads into the North American Academy. I no longer think that, as you probably know. So it's now on the course, and it never used to be. And I used to also have the new critics on there. Now, this is one thing I need to say about Jung. He talks about the new critics, and I don't even have a new critic on there. Not one. Some think that T.S. Eliot is one. I'm not sure he does. But he's often thrown in with them by others. The American new critics are a bunch of academics in the 1930s and 40s, largely in the old southern United States, and they have a certain view of the text. And their view of the text and the way they read the text is they try and read the text as a world unto itself, more or less. And they're not interested in the social context per se. It's not their primary focus anyway. They want to read the text. So when I teach you in my classes and I engage with the text, I'm effectively acting like a new critic, by the way. I've never identified it, but now I put my hand up and I've been doing a new critic thing. And it's not because I'm not bringing in the history and the philosophy and the theological implications. It's because what we're really talking about is the text here, not my own personal social agenda. Let's talk about that. And there's something in the text here which is worthy of us reading and focusing on, as opposed to hearing me lecture. Shakespeare's the great, not Masson. Right? We're not reading me as the text. You don't want to hear my thoughts. Or my thoughts get value because they are rooted in deeper things. So we'll move to the cultural Marxists, and I'll talk about them and the post-structuralists, and they start to, by this point in the semester, you'll start to get vaguely confused, but it will also start to make sense, because the readings will confuse you, the commentary, I hope, will clarify. I hope. It's a lot of stuff thrown at you. Then we'll move to feminism, and when I come to feminism, I always shudder a little bit, because because I'm not a woman, and and not even if I declare I'm still not a woman. Because the term is very difficult to, I mean, our prime minister calls himself a feminist now. I mean, what does it mean? I mean, I can call myself a feminist as well, and I am by certain, I mean, what does the term mean? And they're often described as 3 waves of feminism. So it's going to be a broad lecture that's going to encompass a lot of different things, some of which most people are going to say 100% I'm in agreement with that, and then some of which, yes, but with reservations, and then the third of which is, okay, you've gone off the deep end in that. What the heck is that? Because one of the texts here, Cyborgs by Donna Haraway, is a feminist author. And she's talking about the next frontier for feminism is to get rid of essential femininity in favor of a constructed cyborg sort of humanity. Like, that's what feminism is. It's transgressive. It's breaking the dichotomy of the male-female, because that's part of the feminist movement, is pushing back on this heteronormative masculine identity. So it's not just the female against the male, it's against the very idea of an essential nature. So we can embrace this is very influential now. You'll see it in your movies, sci-fi. I mean, obviously with all the cyborgs and stuff like that. You'll see it in The Walking Dead. And the zombie literature, very, very much exploring on the canvas of the theater what is being discussed in literary theory. Like, what's with the obsession with zombies suddenly? I mean, voodoo, it's a cult. Yeah, we get it. In Haiti, it's sort of a religious African religion. It's pretty gory stuff, the sacrifice of animals and stuff like that. Why are people obsessed with this now? The transgressive, the boundary between the dead and the living, is one of the binaries of structuralism that's being deconstructed there. And now the binary of male and female is similar being so. So we'll come to that, but I've jumped ahead. After feminism, we'll come to deconstruction, and Jacques Derrida will figure prominently there. He talks about Derrida here, so you're going to get the response to Derrida before we actually get to Derrida, but we will look at Derrida, and one of the main texts that he discusses here we will look at. And I think you'll find him interesting. But there's no doubt he is at war with the word. That's the title of the book. There is a war on language and the meaning of language, the veracity of language, the possibility of truthfulness in language. And even the knowledge of God, which Derrida says we can't know. There's no transcendental signified. It's arrogant of us to even claim to be able to know things, and let alone that category of things, such a high idea as God. How dare I? Now, I've heard Jordan Peterson criticize the postmodernists, but he says the exact same thing. He can't affirm that. He doesn't like the question. How could I possibly know such a thing? Such a claim would be monstrous. And arrogant. How dare I? How could I? And he means it to be humble. I mean, he does genuinely, I think. He sounds very much like the school of Derrida and the deconstructionists have worked their way into his psyche. But I think it's not because of Derrida, it's because of psychology. Psychology is also the spirit against the word. But I'll leave that until I come to it. And then finally, the 19th century announced the death of God. Nietzsche famously did it in his work. In the late 1960s, an author by the name of Roland Barthes writes a work called The Death of the Author, by which he means the author of the book. Like, who is the author? There is no author. Leaning in the same direction. Like, we don't know who the author is. We know his work. But we can't make inferences about the author based on that. These are unnecessary and speculative things. So he will follow the deconstructionist path in not only deconstructing the text, but deconstructing the author, and therefore human identity is with us. So there's a sort of a nihilism here, you've noted, and a confusion in it, because categories start breaking apart at that point. If you can't attribute authorship, I mean, if you, it tends not to work its way out in churches quite so specifically yet that we, Paul's letter to the Romans, we say we don't know who wrote that. Well, it's historically been identified with a man by the name of Paul, but we're not sure. You don't get that very often. Not yet. But it's coming. It is coming. For sure. Because it's a natural or inevitable outworking of certain presuppositions about the text and about its authority and the fact that it's not the Word of God, which is the main thrust here. And it has a spillover into literature. So I think what happened first in the field of literature then got brought to Scripture, and if it had been directly applied to Scripture, it would never have succeeded. So it's an end run. We go first to literature, and then we bring it back. The implications which were allowed to... So in the academy for years, Christian seminaries and so forth, they didn't teach literature. They do Bible, they do theology, they'll do pastoral work, sort of, but we're not going to do literature, we're not going to do the liberal arts, we're not going to worry about literary theory, because those are not our focus. Unfortunately, now they are their focus, because they are implicated. Anyway, we'll move on to my friend Jens Zimmerman, his notion of why literary theory, and then on Christian humanism, and I'll provide the links for that. I'm not 100% with him on everything there, but again, I think it's a helpful discussion, and he's written something down there, so it'll give us something to chew on and discuss. And then finally, we'll come to all manner of weird and wonderful things. So post-colonial theory, which is the idea of that there is the view of the canon is a lot like the outworking of the 19th century when the Western powers of Europe go to Africa and colonize them. And post-colonial theory is looking at the way in which the lenses through which we look at things is very much of a Western masculine Anglophone grid, and trying to suggest that it's oppressive by its very nature. Even when it does what used to be seen as a sign of respect, if it appropriates, like whatever's good there, oh, that's good, let's include that in our picture, which is the way the English languages work. It's the genius of the English in some ways, is to assimilate and genuinely give reverence to things that are not from their culture, and yet they think, well, this is good and true and beautiful, let's take that word. English is full of corpses from other languages that have been brought into English now. But post-colonialism sees it only as oppression, and has nothing good to say about it. And that works itself out into Canadian politics and in Canadian literature, particularly in relation to the native discussions and so forth. So we'll look at Edward Said, who is an Arab intellectual that worked down, I think it was at Yale again, who's had a vast influence in the study of literature, again in North America chiefly. And now I think it's come all the way across to the Atlantic to Britain. When I was there, it wasn't so politicized. I think it is now. That was 20 years ago. And then queer theory. I have a little booklet that I'll give you on that. Largely coming from Michel Foucault, the most cited scholar in academia in the last 30 years. I'll say more about him when we come to him, but Peter Sandlin is a Anglican minister, wrote his doctorate on Augustine, and he's writing this little booklet. It's a helpful intro to it. Rather than going to Foucault directly, we'll just get the commentary. And I wish I could go to the original sources, but you can see the course is already big. It gets too big. And then we'll finally move to transhumanism and posthumanism. And as I say, when I do posthuman, it'll be eco-criticism, largely. So it's a big, I'm going all over the place in 1,000 different directions. But I think with the ballast of what we did last semester about what literature is and what humanity is and how they relate together in Christ and in the Word and in the liberal arts, we can probably come to this with some sort of orientation. That on their own, these are all disorienting. So post-1960s, now this is a critique when I was at the University of Durham, and it was there by a leading feminist scholar. She didn't like the designation, Patricia Waugh, but she's a professor, so regularly interviewed, she'd be invited at conferences, and she didn't like feminism, feminist theory, and she didn't like the queer theory, although we didn't even talk about that. But all of these theories she didn't like, and the reason they didn't like it is they said it's anti-humanist. That was it. And so I think it's a good description. These are anti-humanist theories. They are attacking the idea of a common humanity. So they're not only identifying or attacking a common capacity to reason when they're at war with the Word, they're also attacking a common humanity. And if anyone knows anything about the 20th century, when you attack somebody's equal common humanity, it's a pretext to actually attacking them. So I think it's a malicious development. It's not just an academic thing. And I noticed that outlets as august as the CBC are giving airtime to what I regard as terrorist organizations, Antifa and so forth. You would have thought they would at least get some critique, but no, as long as they have the right agenda, I guess. So this is a course that will engage with this and hopefully in some ways equip you to at least think about these things. I say this, I'm not in a social action group. I'm not trying to create culture warriors per se. I'm not. It's not my agenda here. I'm trying to let people understand and think for themselves and then go from there. That's what an academic does. I think there's a place for other types of things, but that's not what happens here. Anyway, and then I'll summarize it all at the end. We'll see what that's, I have no idea what I'm going to say there, but that'll be interesting. Just look at it as a summary lecture. The second essay, I'll give you a bunch of topics. It's a longer essay, and you can take your pick, really. I'll give you some suggestions, but you might want to come up with your own thesis at this point, and I would be very happy with that. But that's about it. There is no class participation mark because I assume that you're going to participate, and I'm not going to bother with the mark. And I hope you will, because there are only 8 of you. Is that right? Yeah. So, comments or questions? So this is what you had from last semester, if you had it. And if you have it, then good. And if you don't, you can get it from other places, the readings from it. But I thought it would preserve that. The Eagleton you can almost certainly get secondhand if you wanted to. And the R.B. Young, you have to order through Amazon. It's not in the bookstore. And the Sandlin, I think they've ordered it, and it should be in the bookstore. It's very cheap and short. But that's about it. Comments or questions about the course? The final thing I'll say is that at the end of this course, the feedback is this is the most useful course I've had in my entire time at Tyndale. Everybody ought to have taken this. That's been a consistent comment. I'm not saying you're all going to agree with that, or that you should even, but that I've read that regularly, and it's my belief that to some degree it does do that, because it does now get really into contemporary commentary, what's going on around us, why are people saying what they're saying? Because this sounds to me, I don't even know where you're coming from. Why are you saying this? And yet I can see it all around me. So if you go into a B.Ed program, you're going to find it there. If you're going to go in the school system, you're going to find it there. And if you're a parent playing hockey, you're going to hear parents talk about and using this sort of language and the attitudes that come with it because they've been taught to think this way. And they've swallowed what they've been taught without thinking about it. And they've never had an alternative, right? So most lit theory courses begin with this. 20th century, they don't get the foundation that I gave. And I did it again so that you might think, wow, actually there is a Christian way of looking at it, and there is a good way of doing lit theory. But this course is pretty negative in the sense that there's a lot of critique. So I think that's that. I wonder if I have a... No, it doesn't even work here. No. All these are boilerplate stuff, right? And electronics and all that guff. Oh, the course handout will come. Okay, then it will come. Yes?
For the book review,
Yeah.
are they 2,000 words?
Thereabouts. Whatever. If you want to do a little bit longer, it's fine. It's
What about shorter?
shorter. Well, I mean, it's... Right, well, because I don't want you just to review what it said. That's not... I want you to engage with it and give me your thoughts on it. That's why I want a lengthier thing. So it's not just a book review, it's a critical engagement with it. It's got 6 chapters. So if you think about it, if each chapter gets 1 paragraph, you're talking about 300 words on each chapter. Well, it's not much. In fact, it's embarrassing to ask for 2,000 words. It should be 5. Right, because 300 words on these are substantive chapters, right? He's dealing with a lot of material. A 300-word paragraph, I mean, that's half a page, or a little over that. On 1 paragraph, that's a pretty condensed summary and a critical engagement with it. So no, it might be longer even. I'm not even sure about the word length. But 2,000, no, you can't do shorter than that. Not do it any justice. At least that's my sense. Yeah, we don't do that. Anyone else or anything else? So as usual, I talk a lot and will lecture, but I'd like your responses along the way, and that will be really helpful. So you have to do the reading before we come to the class, because what I'm not going to do is tell you what the author said exactly. I mean, I will engage. So when we come to Eagleton next class, and he says, what is literature? I will directly refer to it, but I'll be making comments on it. And if you haven't read it, the commentary is not very helpful, I think. Whereas if you have read it, then the commentary might be helpful. I'd like to think it is. That's what I'm here for. Okay? Okay, well then that's it for now, and I'll see you next time. And